Eleanor Williams's claims that she'd been trafficked by an Asian grooming gang led to protests, racist attacks, and claims of a cover-up. Eventually, she was jailed for lying.
I don't want to be that girl that cries rape. I'm not that person.
I'm Sky News' Jason Farrell, and in Unreliable Witness, we ask, why did she lie? And explore unanswered questions with new revelations. Follow Unreliable Witness wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, it's Leah Boleto here on The Daily. A quick scroll on social media and video after video, you see that moment. A cargo ship crashes into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore on the US East Coast. Within seconds, it's gone. The bridge collapses. Rescue teams rush to the scene, but it's raised so many questions. Who was on the bridge? Why did it collapse so quickly? There was even footage of cars toppling into the river. And of course, local people were devastated.
The house shook a little bit, and at first I thought it was a sonic boom from an airplane, but there was no boom at the end, so I knew that wasn't it. But I've never heard a sound quite like it. It lasted for 6 to 10 seconds, just indescribable.
2 people were rescued, pulled out of the river. But at the time of publishing this podcast, there are several other people still unaccounted for. Later, we'll hear from a structural engineer on why the 1.5-mile bridge didn't stand a chance when the ship hit. He's also a Baltimore resident.
Processing sort of the emotional part of something that's been part of the fabric of a city for 50 years is a lot for everybody. All of us look at tall buildings and long bridges and kind of imagine them being there forever.
But first, our US correspondent Martha Kelner is in Baltimore. Martha, just talk us through when you first arrived at the scene, because you got there just before sunrise. Talk to us about what struck you the most.
I think because the collapse happened in the dark, it was really only as people woke up, and for many of those who live in the houses on the banks of the Patapsco River, they looked out of their window that they saw the sheer scale of the destruction. The whole middle section of the biggest bridge in Baltimore completely collapsed, and it really does look incredibly dramatic, quite shocking to see. And I imagine even more shocking for the people of Baltimore who have got so used to that being sort of a permanent fixture of their skyline.
As I've learnt more about the story, not so surprising, but the emotional attachment, I suppose, that people have to that bridge. There was a woman talking about how a few days ago, through tears, she was talking about how she'd drawn the bridge for a birthday card for her husband. Have you managed to speak to anyone locally to sort of get a sense of how everyone's feeling at the moment?
Just a sense of complete shock and devastation. The bridge is, something that people here feel fond of. The governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, talking about how he heard the words, "the Key Bridge is gone," because here they call it the Key Bridge rather than the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And he said it shook him to his core. And he says he knows that everyone in Baltimore will feel the same way. And I think it's obviously first and foremost a tragedy for those who are impacted on the front line here. But it's also going to be an issue that causes chaos for commuters for weeks, possibly months to come, because this is one of the major arteries that, surrounds the city of Baltimore. 30,000 Marylanders use it every single day to get to and from work, to and from school, wherever they might be going. So I think it is a huge loss in terms of infrastructure as well.
Martha, you've been to the press conference and it was hosted by the governor of Maryland. We've got some really clear details now of what happened. First of all, let's talk about who was on the bridge at the time. Do we know much about that?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of confusion initially about just who was on that bridge, how many vehicles, if any, were on that bridge, how many people were on that bridge. We now know that it is probably 8 construction workers who were on that bridge, 8 people working to fix potholes, not working apparently to fix any structural issues on the bridge, but just working to repair potholes in the road surface. And as far as we understand, there weren't many other vehicles on that bridge.
And Martha, key to this story, I suppose, is that mayday call that was made before the ship hit the bridge because what they were able to do was to stop any other traffic crossing the bridge. I mean, heroes, essentially.
Mm-hmm. That's how the Governor, Wes Moore, described those officials on either side of the bridge. He said they are heroes today. Just about the mayday call, you can tell from CCTV cameras and marine tracking data that boat was having problems in the minutes before it hit the bridge. We now understand that a mayday alert was issued by the crew aboard that vessel, and apparently that allowed the message to be relayed to officials on either side of the bridge. It's important also to note this is a toll bridge, so there are always people stationed at either side of the bridge, and they were able to then stem the traffic, so there weren't as many, if any, other vehicles on that bridge, and presumably that played a big part in this being, not quite as catastrophic as it could have been. Obviously, it is still an enormous tragedy for those impacted. Could have been so much worse if it happened in the middle of the day as well.
Martha, in terms of the rebuild, lots of people will be thinking about what happens next. How quick can we assume that rebuilding will take place? Any word on that?
Yeah, I think the authorities sort of keen to convey the message that the primary focus here is on the search and rescue and recovery effort, but eventually focus will turn to the rebuild because that bridge is so important for keeping this city moving. The Governor, Wes Moore, said it's a long-term project. He says it will involve every facet of this society in order to get that bridge up and running again. Interestingly, he said that they would try to rebuild the bridge in a way that honours those who have been impacted by this tragedy. So I think you can expect to see a bridge design that perhaps honours the sort of victims of this tragedy, perhaps a memorial plaque, that sort of thing.
And then I suppose, what does it look like now? Because there'll be a concerted effort, won't it, to presumably get the ship into a safe port, or do you know what's happening there? Because it was heading to Sri Lanka, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was around half an hour into a 27-day journey. It had just left Baltimore harbour. I don't know how long it will take for that boat to be moved. It is a huge boat. Interestingly, I spoke to a gentleman who lives, less than a mile away from that bridge. He sees these cargo container shipping vessels go past every day. He said this one looked unusually packed. You can see all of those sort of multicoloured containers stacked up very high, very wide. They will take a while to move.
And it's so interesting. It's huge, this huge container ship. I was reading somewhere that it's 4 football pitches in size. So the stature is also quite immense there. But on board were what they call 2 pilots that essentially navigate in and through the bridge. What do we know about their job and how difficult that was at 1 a.m. in the morning?
Those pilots, we assume, are the people who made that mayday call to the Coast Guard, who put out that alert that they were unable to change the course of that boat. They warned, in effect, of the catastrophic incident. So in a way, we may find out that they played their part in avoiding this becoming even more catastrophic. But certainly this will have a major impact on the supply line for products and services in Baltimore and beyond. This is one of the busiest ports in America, and in terms of ports that supply motor vehicles, it is the number one port in America. So there will be significant impact in terms of distribution. Amazon have a major factory that's stationed just at the other side of the harbour. So I think there will be a big impact in terms of business and deliveries for days, weeks, possibly to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Martha, what's your kind of next steps then? You're on the ground, you're going to be talking to people, you're going to get a sense of the impact, I suppose, in the next few days, because as a news story, we often just move on, don't we, to the next big story. But this is going to take days, weeks for the local community to recover from, essentially.
Yeah, and I think the investigation will be lengthy, probably quite traumatic for this community as they come to terms with what's happened. I think for us and our sort of news gathering team, it's about going out and speaking to the people who have been most impacted by this tragedy. So, there is this search still ongoing for some people in the water. Clearly questions about whether there could have been more done to get those construction workers off the bridge as well after that mayday call went out. So I think it's about asking those questions to people in positions of authority as well.
Thanks so much, Martha. With us now is our science correspondent, Thomas More. Thomas, I've watched that video of the moment that ship hit the bridge over and over again today. Obsessed with it a little bit. But what can we tell from what happened in the moments before it did hit the bridge? Because power seemed to go out. What can we take from that?
It's like 4 minutes to disaster when you watch that video. So the ship comes in from one side, seems to be going just fine. And then suddenly all the lights go out. And that's really unusual. That points to some kind of engine failure. Now, when the engine fails, and this was a ship that was moving at almost 9 miles an hour through that water, the propeller stops, that flow of water over the rudder at the back of the ship begins to fall quite quickly. And the captain and the pilots on board would have lost all ability to steer the ship. And this is a 100,000-ton mega vessel in one of the biggest cities in the world. It just doesn't bear thinking about.
So, Thomas, can you just talk us through? There would have been a sequence of events for a mayday call, for those on board knowing that there was a problem. What would have happened?
Well, let's rewind slightly. So 12:45 in the morning, the Dali leaves the port of Baltimore, destined for Colombo in Sri Lanka. Now, it had to sail down the river out into the Chesapeake Bay. That would have taken it under the Key Bridge that spans the river at its mouth. It would have had two pilots on board. One pilot, who was an expert in the local waterways, would have helped the ship undock, make its way out of harbour. And then another one was there to help it navigate its way down through a series of buoys in the water, red and green. And the ship should be steering through this navigational channel that is there marked out because it's deep enough for a ship of that size, but also confines it within a safe space so that it doesn't hit structures like the bridge. Now, something went wrong. At first, people thought maybe it was possibly a human error, that maybe they got confused at night by all the lights in the background and didn't see the red and the green and lost their way, perhaps, or didn't look at the radar.
What it shows you, I don't know what you think, that when things aren't done right, when things aren't in place, maritime infrastructure is so fragile, isn't it?
I think there will have to be questions over the movement of ships of this size down a relatively narrow waterway and a safe navigational passage. Should there have been at least one tug on the bow or the stern, the front or the back of the ship, perhaps even two, so that if the ship itself loses power, there is a fail-safe there. There is some way of steering it away, averting a disaster like this. I'm sure that's something that authorities will be looking at.
Thanks, Thomas. We'll pause there and we'll be back in a moment with a structural engineer expert from Baltimore's Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back. Baltimore's skyline is now changed forever after today's bridge collapse. With us now is Professor Ben Schafer, a structural engineer from Johns Hopkins University. Hey Ben, great to catch up. Thanks so much for your time. I just wanted to find out, have you been on the bridge and what do you make of the structure?
Yeah, I've driven across it several times. I've even taught about it in a course here at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. It was always a marvelous light steel arch bridge. It's been there since the late 1970s.
How important was the bridge to local people? Because it was a monumentous sight, wasn't it?
Yes. So it is certainly one of the major things you see from downtown Baltimore as you look out across the harbor. Like most major cities, we have a large ring road, and it is an integral part of that as well.
We've all seen the video of it collapsing and collapsing quite quickly. Is it normal for a bridge to suddenly just disappear in front of our eyes?
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing, right? Kind of looks like the video games their kids play when they're building bridges on them these days. So obviously, every situation is unique. Most bridges have basically two supports, like this bridge, and all evidence is one of those two supports were taken away. So not a much opportunity for the bridge to do anything about it except fall to the water.
And Ben, how long was it? I was reading it's ranging from about 1.2 miles, 1.6 miles, I think. Did the size have anything to do with how it so quickly collapsed?
This is considered a long span bridge. It has a bunch of short approach spans and then the one long main span that you see there that collapsed. It's certainly not extraordinarily long from structural engineering standpoint. It wasn't a world's longest or anything, even when it was completed in the 1970s, but absolutely it requires skill and expertise to design and fabricate and even to maintain.
But its length wouldn't have led to it having weak spots.
If you think of just about a tree across a river that's supported on two stones, I don't know that you'd say its weakest spot is that it's only supported in 2 points. Right. So it's not, there's sort of no redundancy in that sense, but, a few bridges have them. That's the whole point, is to cross the water and let the boats go underneath. Right. So this one's a little bit larger scale, but I don't think there's anything, that we look at and say, oh, well, we certainly don't build them that way or ever would again or anything like that.
Yeah, our thoughts go out to those who have been affected by what's happened. There is an active rescue operation taking place. But I wonder, to cast our minds forward for a moment, and when we start thinking about, well, actually, the bridge will have to be rebuilt at some point, there will be thoughts, I wonder, about the redesign and whether you think it will be built differently.
I think the economics of bridges at this span have changed quite a bit since the 1970s, and you're quite likely to see a cable-stayed bridge or a different bridge form just from what we can build most efficiently and what is also considered kind of most elegant at this time. We don't build as many of these metal truss bridges as we did in the middle part of the 20th century for a variety of reasons. They have a lot of parts and it takes a lot of labor to put them together. I think the real thing this is going to open up for us as we all think about bridges is the relationship between the ports and the bridges, right? So I mean, this is a major shipping channel. This is a major port for the entire east coast of the United States. The bridge has stayed the same since the 1970s. The port traffic and the size of the boats and all of those things have changed radically since then. And I think these are some of the things that we'll need to think about as civil engineers that worry about our infrastructure as we think about rebuilding this and opening it back up for port traffic. I mean, is going to be stressful and critical.
How many other types of bridges are there in America that are built like this, and indeed the world? Because you mentioned it was a truss bridge. For those who are listening that are not familiar with how bridges are built, what does that mean?
Well, in the UK, you have the most famous cantilever bridge in the world, the Firth of Forth Railway Bridge. A beautiful structure that's had a number of bridges built around it, and that was created after the collapse of the Firth of Tay in Scotland, which is, in your own history, was a story of learning about what we can and can't do with metal bridge design. So a lot of this was learned from you in the Industrial Revolution and come forward. These bridges are all over the world. They're stable, and some of them have more than 100-year design lives that they're handling just fine. I think other things have changed. When you look at this accident, it would appear, at least at this point, that the container ship literally hit the support head on. And there's not a bridge you can build that's supported at 2 points that can survive one of those points being removed.
How much do you think it will cost then to rebuild the bridge? Because it's needed, it's going to have to happen, and it's going to be a big blow, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not a great cost estimator for a bridge at this span and length. But the only thing we can say right away is it's not tens of millions; it's usually hundreds of millions these days, and so it'll be a big economic hurdle for sure.
And just lastly, Ben, your thoughts. It's one of these, sites that you see every day. You take it for granted almost. It's gone now in quite a dramatic fashion. How do you feel waking up and it not being there?
processing sort of the emotional part of something that's been part of the fabric of a city for 50 years is a lot for everybody. And I think all of us look at tall buildings and long bridges and just kind of imagine them being there forever.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
That's all from us today. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.